Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. In Abaddon, dawn comes softly, like a mother easing a sleeping child off her back, and the city greets it with a yawn of generators and the throat clearing of hawkers testing their morning voices. Amanda learned that rhythm before she learned the cracks in the compound wall, rising at the first cockcrow to sweep the veranda, rinse the enamel cups till they winked at her, and listen to the road beyond the gate breathe itself awake. She had come down from Enugu with a suitcase that still smelt of starch and hope, believing that marriage would be a bridge from girlhood dreams to womanly harvests. She found instead that the bridge had tolls she could not have counted in advance. Wembley Hill Estate wore its pride in neat hedges and fresh paint, but Amanda soon discovered that a beautiful fence does not guarantee the laughter inside it. Johnson, the man whose charm could move a crowd the way music moves knees, was all silk where eyes could see and flint where only she could feel. He carried himself like Lagos traffic at noon, loud, insistent, convinced the road belonged to him. And in that first year, she kept trying to become a smaller car just to avoid being scraped. A good wife does not chase the sun, he liked to say, a proverb he used as a padlock on her future whenever she mentioned finishing the tailoring course she had paused in Enugu. Amanda smiled in public because that was what survival wore in Wembley Hill, smiles ironed flat and pinned with silence. She kept her voice folded like a headscarf, used her hands to measure salt and peace in the kitchen, and taught her feet to take the long way around his moods. The city helped her pretend. Dugby Market, with its chatter and chilies, could make anybody forget a wound for an hour. The suya smoke on the evening breeze could baptize a bad day in pepper and promise. She wore wrappers that matched the floor tiles because blending became a kind of shield, and she learned the power of speaking with her eyes only, especially on Sundays when neighbors praised Johnson's generosity, as if kindness were a lantern he alone had discovered. When cars with tinted windows rolled by and security men saluted like metronomes, Amanda felt like a note in a symphony she hadn't been taught to read. Yet she watered the hibiscus by the front step every morning, whispering to it like a friend who would not betray her, and the flowers returned her loyalty with red cups that drank the sun. Some evenings the sky over Abaddon unfurled a shawl of copper and ash, and she would stand in that doorway and tell herself the old Igbo saying her grandmother loved, "When the road is longer than your feet, let patience carry your ankles." Ethan and Grace were the drumbeat that kept her walking that long road, two small miracles who turned the house into something more than polished silence. Ethan, 9 and already bargaining with ideas like a market boy haggling over second-hand radios, could spend an hour turning bottle caps into fleets of buses, mapping routes across chalk lines on the back steps like he was planning Osso Rock's next highway. He had the sort of eyes that saw the screws behind the smile of a toy, and on some afternoons he would stand under the ceiling fan calculating what made it faithful to its circle. Grace, 7 with braids that caught the sun like river water, moved through rooms as if music were a wind only she could hear. Her doll wore scraps of ochre Amanda couldn't bear to throw away, and the doll never lacked new dresses because Grace's fingers believed in beginnings. In the kitchen, the mother measured time in lunch boxes, bread trimmed into squares that looked like promises, boiled eggs that glistened like little moons, oranges peeled in one long ribbon, a skill she learned from her mother in Enugu when they sat on low stools shelling groundnut and gossip. The children taught her how to laugh without apology. They asked questions adults had mislaid. Where do thunder and silence live when they aren't working? Why does the kettle sing only when it's hot? Do lizards ever dream of being birds? Amanda made a habit of answering with stories, weaving Enugu rains and Nsukka hills into tales that ended with courage balancing a pot on its head and walking straight. On school mornings she walked them past the gate, the guard nodding at the children like a chief blessing seedlings, and they stopped by a woman who sold akra that wore pepper like tiny earrings. Those walks were soft threads in a hard cloth, reminders that sweetness could be stitched into a day. Inside the house, however, she kept a ledger of invisible arithmetic. Count the times he breathes anger, subtract the steps that will cross his path, divide your words by a gentler number. It wasn't fear that wrote that math, not entirely. It was the wisdom women pass over steaming pots and in church pews, the science of staying whole in a house built partly of shards. When neighbors visited and declared that she must be enjoying, Pointing at the imported curtains with the same pride they reserved for graduation photos, Amanda would smile and say, "We thank God," and tuck the conversation behind her teeth like a clove for later strength. Her quiet was not empty. It was a calabash turned mouth down to keep the dust off the water. The estate itself behaved like a watchman who never slept, always noting who parked where, which delivery truck arrived with what, whose generator coughed in a brag and whose whispered. On certain evenings, when the harmattan turned the air to chalk, Amanda would walk to the corner shop for sachet water and onions, and the road would offer its theater. Boys kicking a football with the seriousness of diplomats, aunties calculating cloth at the tailor's, a preacher with a microphone tethered to a cracked speaker reminding everyone that life is a loan. She found comfort in the market's grammar. How a raised eyebrow could cut 10 naira off a price, how the smell of smoked fish could call forgotten hunger by its childhood name. Dugby's aisles were a maze she could master. There, her hands decided what came home, not Johnson's temper. She bought tomatoes that blushed like shy brides, peppers that strutted, onions that made even strong women blink, and when she carried them back in a raffia basket hooked in the crook of her arm, she walked like a woman who owned at least this much of her day. Inside, she hid herself in rituals, ironing school uniforms until the pleats stood like soldiers, rubbing a whisper of shea butter into Grace's scalp, checking Ethan's homework with a pencil that left stars in the margins when he did well. She was crafting normal, brick by patient brick, even as she learned to measure the weather of Johnson's return by the sound of his key in the lock. If the key rattled twice, she knew to reduce the volume of the television. If it scraped, she ushered the children to the table. If it sang, she allowed herself a breath. In church, Amanda sang alto because it let her anchor the hymn from below, and there was something brave in carrying a tune from the belly. The pastor's wife once asked her to join the women's committee, and Johnson said it would interfere with home management. So Amanda smiled and declined, then folded the invitation into a book of proverbs like a leaf pressed flat for memory. At night, when the compound dimmed and the fridge hummed the same stubborn melody, she wrote tiny lists on paper slips and hid them in a cracked recipe book. Things to teach the children, things to remember about herself. One line returned often: "When the wind forgets your name, learn to be your own breeze." It was not that Johnson lacked soft moments, only that his softness, when it showed, had the half-life of a harmattan dew, there at first light, gone by breakfast. He could be generous with things that made noise, donations at harvest, applause at meetings, but he was stingy with the bread no one sees, the patience a family eats day by day. On certain Fridays he came home with grilled catfish wrapped in foil, and he laughed, an easy sound that made even the walls lean in as if they hoped to keep it. And then, like a generator that had been cheated on fuel, the humor sputtered and died at the slightest slight. Amanda discovered she was living with a weather system, learning when to carry an umbrella, even inside her own room. She kept a small tin of savings at the back of the pantry, behind a tower of beans, each note folded tight the way women fold secrets, and when she counted it at month's end she did so by feel, not sight, as if money could be shy and run if stared at. She used idioms now as stepping stones. The goat that has someone holds its rope short. The river that forgets its source will travel without songs. When a pot knows fire, it does not fear smoke. She poured those proverbs into Ethan and Grace like vitamins dissolved in morning tea, hopeful that strength could be taught ahead of need. And every so often, on nights when the moon parked itself like a white calabash over a badon, she stood barefoot on the veranda and let the concrete cool her soles, closing her eyes to listen for the sound of the life she had wanted knocking from a far gate. She did not think of escape yet. She thought of endurance as a craft, of dignity as a mat woven one reed at a time. There are women who shout their battles and women who sharpen their silence, and Amanda had become the latter, not because she feared sound, but because in this house, quiet could slide where complaint would be caught. The pigeons on the wire above the compound watched her each morning like old aunties, and sometimes she watched them back and wondered what it would cost, in feathers and faith, to learn their sky. The morning it became clear that Johnson's cough was not a passing visitor. The compound smelled of damp earth and boiled yam from the kitchen, a scent that clung to the walls as though it wanted to eavesdrop. Amanda woke to the sound of his breathing, thick and uneven, the kind that makes the listener hold her own breath without realizing. She fetched warm water, added a pinch of salt for him to gargle, and watched him lean over the basin, his reflection on the water's surface trembling like a man unsure of his footing. Outside, the air carried the distant cries of hawkers selling agbalumo along the main road to Dugby, voices rising and falling like a restless tide. The harmattan haze sat low over Abaddon's rooftops, turning even the brightest clothes on the lines into muted ghosts. Johnson muttered about a meeting he would miss in Lagos, as if that was the greater tragedy, and waved her away when she suggested a longer rest. "Time waits for no man," he said, coughing into a handkerchief spotted with something darker than dust. Amanda wanted to tell him that time sometimes forces a man to sit, that it will drag him to a chair if he refuses to walk there himself, but she swallowed her words. In those early days of the illness, she became both nurse and shadow, following him through the house with cups of warm tea, marking medicine times on a scrap of paper, and adjusting curtains so light fell softly on his eyes. His appetite dwindled until even his favorite Nkwobi from the shop in Makola sat untouched. Ethan asked if Baba was going to school with them, and Grace whispered that his voice sounded smaller. The house felt like it had grown new walls, ones you could not see, but which rearranged the air, keeping everyone careful in their movements. Visitors came, tapping their feet at the entrance, bringing baskets of oranges or tins of malt, talking loudly about football to cover the unease. Amanda smiled politely, poured drinks, and let them believe the storm in her living room was only a passing cloud. At night, when the streets outside softened into quiet, she could hear the far-off rumble of trailers heading toward Lagos, their lights slicing through the dark like promises too distant to keep. She thought of Enugu nights when the crickets played their orchestra, of the narrow footpath to her mother's garden, and of the days when she believed marriage was a road without potholes. But here, in Wembley Hill, the road had holes big enough to swallow silence whole, and she could only keep walking one step after another, holding the hands of her children in the dark. The visits to the hospital became part of their weekly rhythm, as predictable as the call to prayer from the small mosque near the estate gate. Johnson hated the smell of disinfectant, said it made the air taste like coins, and sat with his arms crossed in the waiting area, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan that labored to keep the room cool. The doctor, a man from Benin with glasses perched low on his nose, spoke gently but directly. He explained test results in careful Yoruba, adding English when the terms refused to translate neatly, and advised more rest than work. Amanda listened to every syllable, storing them in her mind as if they were precious beads to be strung later. Johnson heard only what he wanted, the parts about no immediate danger and monitoring progress, and discarded the warnings like fruit peels. On the drives back from the hospital, they passed Bodija Market, alive with the scent of smoked fish and ripe plantains, and Amanda would sometimes slow her gaze on the women in bright wrappers who negotiated prices with sharp voices and free hands. She imagined herself among them, trading goods, earning money, standing on her own feet. But Johnson's presence beside her was a wall that blocked the thought before it could take shape. In the evenings, his temper began to show new edges. Small inconveniences grew into arguments, and Amanda learned to measure the tone of his voice before stepping into a room. Grace stopped singing as loudly, and Ethan began spending more time drawing in his notebook, sketching wide bridges and towers that reached into skies where no one coughed. The compound's dogs, restless at night, barked at passing shadows, their voices sharp against the stillness. Amanda took to sitting on the veranda after everyone slept, watching the stars struggle through the harmattan haze, and telling herself in Igbo, "Mwani Marachi, Ojim Kachi Yama. A woman who understands will make her day shine." She was beginning to understand something she could not yet name, something that whispered in her ear whenever Johnson's cough echoed through the house like an unanswered knock. When the illness deepened, it pulled the household into a rhythm dictated by medicine schedules, clinic visits, and the unpredictable moods of a man unaccustomed to being slowed. Amanda became familiar with the sight of prescription slips, thin papers that carried heavy instructions, and the way pharmacists folded them into small squares as if reducing the paper could reduce the burden. She learned which nurses were quick with their hands, which ones let the needle linger longer than needed, and which ones whispered their own prayers as they worked. Johnson began to cancel more meetings, a sign that unsettled him more than the fever itself. He stared at his phone for hours, scrolling through messages, replying to some, ignoring others, his thumb pausing often as though considering a call he would not make. Amanda noticed the calls from Patrick increased, brief conversations that ended with Johnson shaking his head. She caught fragments, mentions of business continuity, legal papers, the company's interest, phrases that meant little to her in detail but felt heavy in their repetition. She also noticed new visitors, men who smelled of expensive cologne and spoke in low tones, who left quickly without finishing their drinks. The children watched these comings and goings from behind the sitting room door, their eyes wide with the curiosity of those too young to grasp the weight of adult matters. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Amanda found herself in the kitchen peeling oranges in silence. The knife moved through the fruit with a precision born not of concentration, but of the need to keep her hands busy while her mind wandered to what the doctor had said. We will need to watch for complications. In another life, she might have told her mother this news over the phone, might have heard advice sprinkled with prayers, but here she simply folded the thought into herself, the way she folded laundry, neatly, without fuss, and with the quiet hope it would not unravel too soon. The day the sickness was named in full was a day that carried the smell of dust and rain together, as though the weather could not decide which face to wear. The doctor's words were calm, but Amanda felt them as though they were stones dropped into her chest, each one sending ripples she could not control. Johnson's face betrayed nothing. He nodded, thanked the man, and rose to leave, as if a diagnosis were merely an item to be ticked off a list. On the ride home, the traffic on the road to Gate was heavy, with buses packed so full that passengers' elbows pressed like unwilling dance partners. Street sellers wove between cars, offering everything from plantain chips to phone chargers, their voices threading through the blare of horns. Amanda sat quietly, the doctor's words replaying in her mind, twisting into shapes that looked like the future. She imagined the bills stacking higher than the shelves in the living room, imagined the house filling with the smell of medicine, imagined the sound of relatives whispering in corners. Johnson, still in control of the wheel, spoke of a contract in Port Harcourt he would not cancel, said it was too important to let go. Amanda nodded, knowing that some storms do not wait for a man to finish his errands. That night, she lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, sometimes steady, sometimes catching, and she thought of the proverb her grandmother loved. When the drumbeat changes, the dancer must change his steps. She could feel the beat changing, slow but insistent, and she wondered if she had the shoes for the dance that was coming. The morning Johnson did not wake at his usual time. The compound was still, as if even the air knew to hold its breath. The roosters in the neighbor's yard had crowed, the bread seller's horn had sounded twice on the road outside, and yet the bedroom door remained shut. Amanda, already dressed in a wrapper and faded blouse, stood by the doorway for a moment longer than usual, her hand hovering near the handle as if it needed the courage to turn. Inside, the curtains were drawn, bathing the room in the pale light of an indecisive dawn. Johnson lay on his side, his breathing shallow, his face damp with the sheen of a night's long struggle. She called his name, softly at first, then louder, her voice a small wave against a shore that did not answer. When she touched his shoulder, the cold was not yet complete, but it was far enough along to make her chest tighten in a way that felt permanent. For a heartbeat, she thought of calling Patrick first, then the hospital, but instead she sat beside the bed, both hands over her mouth, feeling the truth fill her like water rising in a jar. Ethan's footsteps approached, his voice asking if Baba was going to drive them to school, and Amanda stepped quickly into the hallway, closing the door behind her as if to keep the cold from spilling out. The rest of the morning moved with the stiffness of a clock whose hands had been bent. The calls to the hospital, the measured footsteps of the nurse who confirmed what Amanda already knew, the arrival of neighbors whose eyes darted around the sitting room as though grief might be hiding in the curtains. By afternoon, the compound was a stage for hushed conversations, a steady stream of people arriving with plastic chairs, pots of jollof, and condolences that fell into the air like coins into a deep well. Patrick arrived just before dusk, his caftan pressed so sharply it could have cut paper, his expression rehearsed to balance sorrow with authority. He embraced Amanda in a way that felt like a handshake, and she noticed how quickly his eyes moved past her to the doorway leading to Johnson's study. That night, when the compound quieted and the visitors had gone, she sat with her children on the veranda, their heads against her sides, and told them they would be all right. She did not know yet if the words were true, but she said them slowly, as if the pace alone might make them believable. The days leading to the burial blurred into one another, stitched together by the comings and goings of relatives whose faces carried more calculation than mourning. Amanda found herself in rooms where decisions were being made without her voice, her presence tolerated, but her opinions dismissed. Meetings about the burial arrangements were held in the parlor, with Patrick at the center, flanked by cousins and uncles who nodded at every suggestion he made. They spoke of hiring a band from Lagos, of ordering Aso a bee that would match the family's prestige, of hiring buses to bring mourners from their hometown in Anambra. When Amanda asked about the cost, Patrick waved a hand and said the company would cover it. But she noticed the way his words held a certain weight, as though he was already tallying what would be recovered later. Strangers came to measure the sitting room for canopies, to mark spaces for the caterers, to discuss where the condolence register would be placed. Her own room became a refuge from the noise, though even there the murmur of plans crept under the door. On one afternoon when the sun leaned heavily on the compound walls, a lawyer came, thin, bespectacled, with a black folder tucked under his arm. He greeted Amanda politely, but his steps led him straight to Patrick. She did not know it yet, but that folder contained the map of her next chapter, drawn in lines she had not been invited to shape. Ethan and Grace, sensing the change in the air, stayed close to her, their play quieter, their questions fewer. In the evenings, after the last visitor left, Amanda would walk the compound's perimeter slowly, her fingers brushing the rough cement walls as if memorizing their texture, unsure how much longer they would still be hers to touch. The moon above seemed paler these nights, and the breeze carried a thinness that made her pull her wrapper tighter. It was in these quiet rounds that she began to understand. Grief was not the only thing that had entered her home. Something colder had arrived alongside it, and it had a name she could not yet say. The will was read on a Wednesday, 2 days after the burial, in the same parlor where Patrick had conducted his meetings. Amanda sat on one of the low chairs, her children beside her, their legs swinging without touching the floor. The lawyer's voice was steady, almost detached, as he listed Johnson's properties. The house in Wembley Hill, a flat in Abuja, the shares in his company, the bank accounts. Each item felt like a bead on a string being drawn slowly through her hands, and she waited for her name to appear, for some acknowledgement of her place in the life she had lived beside him. But when the lawyer reached the part about the next of kin, he spoke Patrick's name with the finality of a door closing. Amanda's own name was absent, as if she had never been more than a shadow in the frame. The assets, the lawyer explained, would be held in trust for Ethan and Grace until they turned 20, and Patrick, as the next of kin, would oversee their management. Her mind caught on the phrase, oversee their management, like a thorn in cloth. When she asked what that meant for her and the children now, the lawyer avoided her eyes, saying only that the family would ensure their welfare. Patrick's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like a man satisfied with the taste of his own meal. Around the room, murmurs rose, some in agreement, some in disapproval, but none of it slowed the reading. When the folder closed, Patrick stood, thanked the lawyer, and began speaking of next steps, in a tone that left no room for her voice. Amanda felt the air in the room grow thin, and she reached for her children's hands, grounding herself in their small, warm palms. She had thought death was the end of her fight with Johnson's shadow, but she could see now it was only the opening of a new battlefield. In the days that followed, the tension in the compound thickened, no longer hidden behind polite greetings. Patrick began to speak more openly about Amanda leaving the house, framing it as a natural order of things. "This is family property," he said one evening, standing near the doorway with 2 uncles beside him. "You and the children will be provided for, but you cannot remain here indefinitely." The words fell into the space between them like stones into shallow water, the splash small but the ripples wide. Amanda listened without blinking, her arms folded, her mind already running ahead of the conversation. She knew enough of such matters to understand that provided for could mean anything from token gestures to outright neglect. That night, she heard voices outside her window, Patrick and another relative, discussing how soon she could be moved, and whether it should be before or after certain documents were finalized. She lay in the dark, her children breathing steadily beside her, and weighed her options like a trader examining goods at a roadside stall. In the morning, she moved through the house with deliberate calm, greeting people, preparing meals, attending to small chores, all the while tucking away pieces of information. Who was in charge of the company accounts, where the property documents might be kept, which of Johnson's friends had remained silent but watchful during these days. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she resolved not to stumble. If they thought she would be moved like a sack of grain, they had mistaken her weight. Amanda noticed it first in the small gestures. Cunnell, one of Johnson's oldest friends from their university days in Ife, stopping by more often than grief alone could explain, and Mama Reese, the stout woman who ran a pepper soup joint near Dugby, always asking after her in a tone that lingered on certain words as though they carried double meanings. These 2 had been constant presences at the burial, their eyes sharper than the rest, watching the movements in the compound like guards studying a chessboard. One afternoon, after Patrick had left for a meeting, Connell appeared at the gate with a bag of bread and sardines, his usual cover for visits that were never about food. He sat in the corner of the parlor, speaking low so the children would not catch the weight of the conversation. "Amanda," he said, leaning forward, "these people will not wait long. You must think ahead before they close every door." His words were not dressed in sympathy, they were lined with urgency. Amanda listened, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the truth of what he said. The family's eyes were already measuring the house, as if it were a carcass to be divided. Mama Reese joined them later, her apron still smelling of goat meat and pepper, and the three of them spoke in pieces, as if stringing together a net in the dark. They talked about the furniture, the cars, the possibility of finding a buyer for the property, before Patrick tightened his grip. Amanda asked how such a thing could be done without attracting attention, and Connell told her that in a city like Abaddon, the quietest deals were sometimes the fastest. The plan was dangerous. It meant acting before the family expected it, using the brief window of distraction while legal formalities dragged on. Amanda's chest felt tight, but she understood there was no safety in waiting for kindness from those who had already counted her out. That night, she walked through the room slowly, running her fingers over the arm of the sofa, the cool edge of the dining table, the framed photographs that had outlived their smiles. Every object seemed heavier, knowing it might soon be lifted and gone. The children slept, unaware of the storm gathering outside their door, and Amanda, standing at the window, whispered a single thought into the quiet. "If I am to leave, I will leave on my own terms." The days that followed became a quiet theater of preparation. Amanda went about her tasks as if nothing had shifted, serving meals, greeting relatives, attending the endless family discussions that pretended to be about her welfare, but were really about control. Meanwhile, Connell moved like smoke through the background, making calls from his car, arranging for a buyer whose questions were few and whose payments came in cash. Mama Reese acted as a messenger, slipping Amanda notes tucked into bags of pepper and plantain, each one carrying small updates or instructions. At night, when the compound's noise sank into the low hum of generators and crickets, Amanda would sit at the edge of her bed, memorizing the sequence of what needed to be done. Move the smaller valuables first, arrange for a truck to come in the early morning hours, ensure the buyer's payment was in her hands before any signature was placed. She handled documents with the care of a woman holding fragile eggs, knowing one crack could spoil everything. Ethan and Grace sensed her restlessness but asked no questions, though Amanda caught Ethan watching her sometimes with a thoughtful frown, as if he suspected more than his age should carry. Outside, Patrick's visits to the company became more frequent, and Amanda overheard snatches of conversation, suggesting he was already making plans for the house once she was gone. That knowledge did not make her fearful, it hardened her resolve. She remembered her grandmother's saying, "When the market fire starts, a wise woman saves her basket before helping others." Every hour was a thread being pulled from a cloth, and Amanda was determined to weave her escape before the fabric collapsed. She began storing some of the children's clothes and important papers in a travel bag hidden beneath the bed, moving them piece by piece so no one would notice. She sold the small jewelry she owned through a trusted neighbor, exchanging gold for crisp notes that she hid inside an old biscuit tin in the kitchen. The plan was not yet in motion, but each step was a seed planted in the soil of her future, waiting for the night it would be watered. The tension sharpened the day Connell told her the buyer was ready to move. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of rain about to fall, when he arrived with a folded piece of paper containing the buyer's offer. Amanda read it twice, her heartbeat quickening, not from greed, but from the sudden reality that this plan was no longer an idea. It was a door swinging open. The amount was enough to buy her time in a new place, enough to pay for school fees and rent, and enough to keep her from relying on the unpredictable charity of relatives. But it also meant the end of this chapter would arrive faster than she had prepared the children for. "You must decide now," Connell said, his voice carrying both urgency and caution. Amanda looked at the paper, then at the walls around her, the ones that had held her in both safety and captivity. She thought of Patrick walking through these rooms with his measuring eyes, thought of the way his voice changed when he spoke to her, as if addressing someone who had already been dismissed. The decision came quietly, like a nod to herself. That evening, she called Mama Reese and confirmed the plan. The sale would be done before the end of the week, the payment in cash, the transfer handled discreetly to avoid triggering any legal delays. She spent the next day marking items for removal, using a system of tiny chalk marks only she would notice. In the kitchen, she packed the tins and plates, not in boxes, but in sacks that could be moved quickly. The rain finally came that night, drumming on the roof like a warning, but Amanda lay awake, listening to its rhythm, knowing the storm outside was nothing compared to the one she would set in motion soon. The final arrangement unfolded with the precision of a ritual. In the pre-dawn darkness of Saturday, a truck rolled quietly into the compound, its engine cut so as not to wake the sleeping occupants. Connell supervised the loading, moving quickly but carefully, while Amanda guided the workers through the rooms, pointing to the marked items. The furniture went first, the heavy sofa, the dining table, the wardrobes, followed by smaller items wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. By the time the sun began to edge over the horizon, the truck was already pulling away, the goods inside hidden beneath tarpaulin. Amanda stood at the gate, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist, watching it disappear down the road toward its destination. Back inside, she counted the payment, the cash stacked in neat bundles that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She placed it in the biscuit tin, now heavier than it had ever been, and slid it beneath the bed. The house looked emptier, its walls bare in places where pictures had hung, its air carrying the faint scent of wood and dust. But to Amanda, it no longer felt like a place she would mourn leaving. She moved through the rooms one last time, her steps slow, committing each corner to memory, not out of sentiment, but to remind herself of the ground she had once stood on and would never return to in defeat. Outside, the day began like any other in Abaddon, with hawkers calling their wares and okadas weaving through traffic, unaware that in one quiet compound, a woman had just rewritten her future. The burial day opened under a sky the color of old iron, the air heavy as if it had been holding its own grief all night. From the early hours, people began arriving, men in crisp agbada smelling faintly of talcum powder, women in geli so elaborate they seemed to compete with the heavens, youths in matching ankara carrying folding chairs and stacking them in neat rows. The compound transformed into a performance space for grief, wailers beating their chests, drummers sending out slow, deliberate rhythms, ushers guiding mourners as though seating them for a play. Amanda moved among them like someone drifting through a dream she had seen before but could not alter, her face calm enough to disguise the calculations running behind her eyes. She had chosen her wrapper with care, subdued but not forgotten, a pattern that would let her blend into the crowd without inviting too much pity or scrutiny. Ethan and Grace stayed close, their small hands seeking hers whenever the noise swelled. Patrick had taken center stage, shaking hands, accepting condolences with a humility that looked polished, his voice rising whenever the conversation turned to family legacy. At moments, Amanda caught his eyes sweeping over the house, the same way a trader sizes a stall before taking it over. Each time, she looked away before his gaze could lock with hers. The service itself passed in a blur, the pastor's voice weaving scripture with subtle praise for Johnson's contributions, the choir's harmonies climbing and falling like tides, the solemn walk to the graveside where red earth waited like a closed mouth. Amanda threw in her handful of sand, the grains catching briefly in the wind before settling on the polished coffin. She did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because tears would have been the smallest part of her truth. What she carried was heavier and sharper than grief. When the burial party returned to the compound, the air was thick with the smell of fried plantain, pepper soup, and fresh palm wine. Guests moved between tents, balancing plates and gossip, their laughter growing louder as the sun dipped lower. Amanda stayed on her feet, circulating with a tray of drinks, her smile fixed but her mind working through the last details of what would happen that night. The sale was already complete, the payment hidden in the biscuit tin under her bed, the truck gone to its destination with everything she had chosen to take. The emptiness left behind had been masked well enough to pass for a home still lived in, curtains drawn in certain rooms, doors closed to others, surfaces kept neat so no one would question why they looked a little barer. As dusk crept in, she excused herself quietly, guiding Ethan and Grace into the house under the pretext of letting them rest. In their room, she brought out the travel bag she had been filling over the past week, tucking in the last few items with a precision born of both necessity and care. She changed into simpler clothes, loose trousers and a headscarf, and dressed the children warmly for the journey ahead. Outside, the noise continued, drums still speaking to the night, voices rising with the rhythm of people who believed the day's work was done. Amanda waited until the sky was deep with shadow before she moved, leading her children out through the back gate, the one that opened into a narrow lane shielded by thick bougainvillea. Connell was waiting in a car, engine running, headlights off. He opened the door without a word, and Amanda helped the children in, their faces lit faintly by the dashboard glow. As they drove away, the compound disappeared behind them, swallowed by the dark. The road to the city center was quiet at that hour, the streetlights throwing their pale circles onto the tarmac like stepping stones. Amanda sat back, listening to the steady hum of the engine, each turn of the wheels carrying her further from the life she had just left without announcement. By the time Patrick and the other family members gathered again 2 days later to begin the handover process, Amanda was hundreds of kilometers away. They arrived with an energy that suggested triumph, keys in hand, ready to inspect the property they believed was now under their stewardship. But when they stepped inside, the silence that met them was not the respectful hush of a home in mourning. It was the hollow quiet of absence. Rooms that should have been full of life stood bare, their emptiness speaking louder than any voice could. The living room held only the echo of footsteps. The bedrooms offered nothing but pale outlines where furniture had once stood. In the kitchen, the shelves were stripped, the air carrying only a faint trace of spices long gone. Patrick's voice rose first in disbelief, then in anger, calling for the caretaker, accusing neighbors, demanding explanations no one could give. The realization spread slowly among them. Everything of value had been taken, not in the chaos of a raid, but with the order and care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Some argued she must have been helped from outside. Others insisted she could not have acted alone. Patrick paced the parlor, his jaw tight, his hands opening and closing as if they wanted something to crush. When one of the uncles suggested calling the police, Patrick waved it off. There was nothing to recover without exposing too much of his own dealings. The conversation turned sour, blame passed back and forth, but no one mentioned Amanda's name with any real hope of seeing her again. She had not just left the house. She had erased her trail so completely that even the dust seemed unwilling to settle in her absence. Far from Abadan, in a modest guest house on the outskirts of Benin City, Amanda sat at a small table counting the money again, her fingers moving over the bundles with the deliberate patience of someone measuring the shape of her next life. Ethan and Grace were asleep in the adjoining room, their breathing soft through the thin wall. Outside, the street was quiet save for the occasional rumble of a passing truck and the distant bark of a dog. She thought briefly of the compound she had left, of the rooms she would never see again, of the faces that had looked at her with calculation instead of care. But the weight in her chest now was not dread. It was the heavy relief of having stepped out of a snare before it closed. She took a pen from her bag and began writing a list. The rent for a new place, the cost of enrolling the children in school, the amount she would set aside for her own studies. Each item was a stone in the foundation she intended to build. She did not yet know which city would hold her next chapter. Perhaps Port Harcourt, perhaps back to Enugu where her roots lay, but she knew it would be a place where no one could dictate her steps. She closed the biscuit tin, slid it back under the bed, and turned off the light. In the darkness, she allowed herself a long breath, the kind that comes only when the danger is behind you. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Years later, the memory of that night's quiet escape had faded into the kind of recollection Amanda could touch without flinching. In Port Harcourt, the mornings were different from Abadan's. Less dust, more salt in the air, the kind that clung to skin like a light shawl. She had chosen a modest 2-bedroom flat in a compound where the walls bore no history of her past, where every face she passed in the corridor was a stranger with no reason to measure her worth against another's. The city moved with the hum of oil tankers and river traffic, and Amanda learned to walk through it as one of its many currents, unremarkable yet purposeful. The children adapted quickly, Ethan taller now, his eyes older than his years, Grace growing into the quiet confidence of a girl who had known loss but not defeat. Amanda kept the tin of money hidden for months, touching it only to pay school fees and rent, until it became lighter, and she decided it was time to plant it into something that would grow. She enrolled in an evening program at a local polytechnic, sitting in classrooms with students younger than herself, her notebooks filled with neat handwriting and small underlined phrases she wanted to remember. The first months were hard. Between her part-time work at a tailor's shop and caring for the children, there were nights she fell asleep over her books. But each test she passed, each skill she added, felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a home she was building not from cement, but from the steady layering of her own will. She learned to navigate the city's markets with a buyer's eye, to mend not just fabric, but the thin places in her life where uncertainty had worn through. And with each passing term, she carried herself a little straighter, as if the weight she bore was shifting from a burden to a crown. Ethan began to dream aloud of becoming an engineer, his notebooks filling with sketches of bridges, roads, and buildings that seemed to belong in cities not yet imagined. Amanda watched him work at the small table they shared, his pencil moving with the quiet focus of someone already speaking a language most had yet to learn. Grace's hands, on the other hand, sought color and fabric. She borrowed scraps from Amanda's tailoring shop, piecing them into doll clothes, then into skirts for herself. By the time she was in secondary school, she was drawing patterns that caught the attention of neighbors, who began to ask if she could make them something for church. Amanda never pushed them into these paths, but she watered each interest the way her mother had watered the garden back in Enugu, with steady attention, patience, and the belief that what was planted with care would bloom in its season. The siblings, though different in their pursuits, worked side by side, trading ideas, helping each other with homework, laughing in ways that filled the small flat with warmth. Amanda noticed they no longer spoke of their father unless prompted, and when they did, it was with the distant tone one uses for a story that has long since ended. Sometimes she thought of the family in Ibadan, wondered if Patrick had tried to look for them in the early years, if he had walked into that empty house and understood the kind of escape she had crafted. But those thoughts passed quickly. She had no desire to dwell in the shadows of people who had chosen to see her only as an obstacle to be removed. Instead, her attention stayed on what was in front of her, the slow but certain transformation of 3 lives that had once been marked for displacement and were now rooted in their own ground. It was during her final year at the Polytechnic that Amanda truly began to feel the shift. She had started to take on more work at the tailors, moving from assistant to managing orders and client relationships. Her designs, once cautious and simple, grew bolder. She experimented with mixing fabrics, adding details that made people stop and look. Word spread beyond the compound, and soon she was receiving calls from women in other parts of the city who had heard of the tailor who works with her own hands. The earnings were not vast, but they were steady, and they came with something she valued even more: independence. She began setting aside money not just for daily needs, but for the future, opening a small account in her own name, a safeguard against the uncertainties she knew too well. On weekends, she and the children sometimes took walks along the waterfront, buying roasted fish wrapped in newspaper, watching the boats sway against the current. It was on one of these walks that she overheard 2 men discussing an oil contract gone wrong, the name Patrick slipping into their conversation. They spoke of debts, of a business crumbling under the weight of poor choices. Amanda said nothing to the children, only nodded to herself at the confirmation of what she had suspected, that the empire he had once guarded so jealously had slipped through his fingers. She felt no triumph in it, only a cool acknowledgement of how the world tends to fold in on those who mistake possession for permanence. Her victory was quieter, measured in the laughter of her children, the neat lines of her own ledger, and the mornings she woke without dread. By the time Grace was accepted into a fashion design program in Lagos, and Ethan received an offer to study engineering at a university in Enugu, Amanda had stopped thinking of their journey as survival. It was something else now, a life built by hands that had learned not to wait for rescue. The day they both left for their respective cities, the flat felt unnaturally still, the air heavy with the absence of their constant movement. Amanda walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, as if to anchor herself in the spaces they had filled. That evening, she sat on the small balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sky change from gold to deep blue. The street below was alive with the sounds of sellers packing up for the day, motorbikes weaving past taxis, children calling to each other in the fading light. She thought back to the girl who had left Enugu with a head full of dreams, the woman who had stood at the back gate of the Ibadan house with her children and a bag of everything that mattered, the nights spent planning in secret, the mornings spent pretending nothing had changed. All of it had brought her here, not to a place of riches or grand applause, but to a steady ground she could call her own. She leaned back, letting the warm evening air wrap around her, and allowed herself a small, private smile. The road had been long, uneven, and at times unforgiving, but she had walked it to the end on her own feet. That, she knew, was the kind of wealth no one could inherit and no one could take away. My advice to you, my dear listener, is simple. Never let the world decide your worth for you. People may underestimate you, shut doors in your face, or try to write you out of your own story, but remember, Your power lies in your ability to quietly prepare, to act wisely, and to move when the time is right. Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it is the sharpest weapon. And now, I pray for you. May you never be trapped in any place where your light is dimmed. May your enemies be confused while your helpers find you with ease. May your hands never be empty, and may your table never lack bread. May you walk into rooms where your name has been spoken for good. May every tear you have shed water the soil of your future victories. May your children bring you peace and not pain. And may your story end in joy that no one can take away. If you believe it, let your heart say a loud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.